Hello, beautiful community. You are in an infinitesimal amount of trouble with me because quite a few of you have requested that I speak about Lex Fridman's request to Zelensky to conduct an interview in Russian. So the way we'll do this to get ourselves out of the naughty step is to do this with a lot of green vegetables that give us a perspective on what is happening with our political discourse. And we'll do it like this. We'll read Lex Fridman's request. Then we'll say a little bit about how a professional journalist working for a mainstream institution would handle this issue. Then we'll say a bit about being a YouTuber, because being a YouTuber doesn't mean, or at least does not necessarily mean being a journalist. And then we'll say something sociological about what the hell is going on with all of these vibes-based pre-political interviews of active political figures, like the Rogan interview with Trump, like the Tucker interview with Putin, although Tucker's interview you could argue was more political, with Lex's interview with Trump. What kind of a thing is this? Is this entertainment? Is this propaganda? How do audiences receive these things? How do they consume them? And consumption is here the right word. Are these things maybe journalism after all? So we'll talk about that. And lastly, I'll talk about an important criticism of Lex's approach that's even a criticism, I think, on his own terms. So let's get into this. Imagine you are Sally Smith, you're 54, and you're thinking about interviewing Zelensky for BBC or CNN. How do you do this? Now, let's add a little hypothetical to spice things up. Imagine that you're Sally Smith, but you've done 2 degrees in French and Russian, and you've lived in a Russian-speaking context for a while, and so you speak Russian, not as well as English, but really quite well. Given that, how do you approach the Zelensky interview? I mean, the short of it is that, and the point of speaking about this is to bring you into the world of professional journalism a bit. You do this by understanding that you cannot dictate the terms of the interview. You can't dictate what language it's going to be in. You can lay out all the options, and you can express a preference. And if the preference you're expressing is a really difficult preference, you acknowledge the radical nature or the unprecedented nature of your request, especially in the context of what your interviewee has done in the past. At a push, you could try to revisit this question at the start of the interview and get a different answer if you want it to be a bit pushy. But you can't dictate it. You give the options and you express a preference. Now, you're thinking on Zelensky's side about one thing, obviously, when you're asking for this. That's that it might be impossible for him to do an interview in Russian for 3 hours politically. And on your side, you're thinking of 2 things. What's the most engaging and constructive conversation I can have here that'll get the best quotes out of Zelensky? And here it makes a difference whether the interview is long or short, whether it's a documentary style interview where you're off camera or an interview where you are a character on camera, shown to be asking the questions. And then the other consideration on your side will be that you have an English-speaking audience that will probably want Zelensky to speak in English to them as far as he can, because he can speak English charismatically enough in a delimited way on certain topics. Zelensky cannot do a 3-hour long form interview in English. His language isn't good enough for that. So that's the balance. Now, as a professional journalist, what you would be frustrated by is the idea of translation. So that is really something that a genuinely professionally serious journalists will have an aversion to, but will be obviously open to if it's necessary. And the aversion is that it's bloody tough to lose half of the time of the interview for the translation, and it completely breaks the organicity. It's really difficult to do. Establishing that connection is critical in a serious interview, and it's bloody tough to do in translation. A really good example of somebody who is extraordinary at establishing a connection, who isn't a journalist, is a filmmaker, who dramatically failed because it was in translation, is Werner Herzog interviewing Gorbachev for his film about Gorbachev. Werner really tried to cut through, and Gorbachev, with the exception of one topic in the film, which is Gorbachev's love for his wife Raisa, Gorbachev didn't get online with Herzog. They kind of missed each other. So it's bloody hard, and you would, if you're Sally Smith and you speak Russian, be tempted to try to interview Zelensky in Russian, but knowing that it might be politically impossible for Zelensky, and also knowing that you may have a responsibility to deliver Zelensky in English to some extent to your English-speaking audience. So that's the sort of the nugget of it. You don't dictate, you give the options, and if you are asking for something that's virtually ungettable or pretty radical, you can still ask for it, but you just basically, have to do so in a way that acknowledges the unprecedented thing you're asking for. That's the professional journal context. Now let's move on to YouTubers. There's a line in the early 1890s in one of the music reviews of George Bernard Shaw about what it means to be a professional musician. And Shaw says, look, don't ask me what the social status of a professional musician is, because a professional musician could be anything from an ex-amateur drummer boy to an artist of genius with a world historical reputation. And so in the same way, there is no such thing really as being a YouTuber. When I say no such thing really, I mean that, of course, you have some collegiate sense of belonging with other YouTubers. If you're a YouTuber, you are on the platform, you know who runs the platform, they have some house rules. But basically, your ethical role isn't being a YouTuber, it is whatever you are being while on YouTube. And even in our sort of niche where much of the content you watch is about Russia-Ukraine, you know that some people do analysis, other people do entertainment, other people do activism, some people do a blend of the three. And they're not the same activities. They're not activities that come with a sense of ethical responsibility. That's why I call myself a baby public intellectual. It gives you clarity about what is going on when you visit this room, metaphorically speaking, right, when it comes to the ethics of how things balance here. So about Lex, you'd probably say that he is a long-form conversationalist. He's a long-form interviewer. And it's easier to attach a set of ethics to that than it is to being a YouTuber, which is just too open-ended. So now let's get closer to what we are perhaps really here after, which is this pre-political interview format with active political figures. Now, for decades, we have related to political figures as being half real, as though they are soap serious characters, which we half take seriously. And when they do something bad, we half take that seriously as a real bad thing that's happened in the world, and half don't. And when they do something good, it's the same. We half think something good has happened in the world, and we half relate to it as a kind of entertainment that's not quite real. That's been a problem for politics for a long time, but something even more dramatic has changed recently. And that is that we have a vibes format of engaging with politics and doing political interviews. They're interviews that are typically empty of political substance, and yet they are interviews with active political figures. And that's worse than the sort of half taking politics seriously soap opera approach. It's an approach that's a consequence of the crisis of trust we're living through, that has generated a magical thinking relationship with politics, that throws out of the window thinking about politics in terms of cause and effect. Who's going to do what, how, and when, and by what mechanisms. If you look at the Rogan interview with Trump, it's a magical thinking interview. Trump is sitting there with some project supposedly of smashing a system that has come to betray American people, has come to be too self-involved and too inept or too corrupt. But what's Trump's solution to this, practically and causally? That's not revealed in the conversation. That proceeds in a vibe-driven, more moral than political, magical thinking sort of format. And we have a proliferation of these kinds of conversations where the elephant in the room is the politics, even though it's a political figure that's being interviewed. That's just like the soap opera story, an expression of depoliticization. The fact that we relate to political items as consumer items, and that's true of us. It's also true of Russians, right? When Russians run to IKEA when the war starts, they're not just running to IKEA to consume objects, they also consume Putin and Navalny as objects you might buy on Amazon. We relate, arguably in a less extreme way, but we relate to politics similarly too. This extraordinary form of consumerist takeover of basic political relations, magical thinking consumerism. So we've got a real problem with this sort of content. Now, let's say something concrete about Lex Fridman's approach, recognizing that we don't judge him by the standards of a journalist, we judge him by the standards of a long-form interviewer. And the biggest problem with Lex's approach is, so far, and he may change and improve, is a tendency to relate to all action and political action, no matter how bad its consequences are, as driven by good intent. That's to say, there is a tendency there to assimilate political projects, even if they don't look too good in practice, to positive intent. So that makes Putin somebody who loves his country, who's ended up killing Ukrainians because his understanding of what it means to love his country has gone wrong. Now, what's missing here? What's missing here are negative values, right? It's the fact that you can't assimilate all human action to positive values gone wrong. You have to assimilate what Putin is doing, not just to love of country, plus some perhaps empirically false beliefs, or some misconceptions, or some unfortunate, pathological impulses that are fundamentally still part of a positive intent to, do the best for your country. You have to assimilate much of what Putin does to destructiveness, to a quest for power, to a desire to destroy, to sadistic impulses. Human beings have these two capabilities, two sets of capabilities, right? A constructive and a destructive capability. And you have to send the destructive capability if you're going to describe bad stuff being done politically. And then there's this further problem, namely that if you try to assimilate everything to positive intent gone wrong, you are at risk of excessively equalizing, in this case, between Putin and Zelensky. They're both people who are trying to do the best for their country, who have different views of the world, but then may also have various kinds of misconceptions, empirical errors, and some bad psychological nicks, and so on. You can't do that. You have to center the destructive values that are driving much of what Putin does. So that's a very important corrective. Final remark. I notice that some of you, and I can't get involved in this debate because I just haven't followed the details, but I noticed that some of you are criticizing Lex Fridman for not releasing interviews with Ukrainians that he'd done when he was in Ukraine a couple of years back. The structure you want, if you're going to try to make that case, is Lex is a long-form interviewer. A set of ethics come with that. And then here you go and you make the case that that set of ethics that comes with being a long-form interviewer is incompatible with some of the decisions he's taken. So that's the structure you have to use if you're going to make that criticism. So I think at the level of saying a little bit about professional journalism, at the level of saying something about YouTubers, at the level of saying something about how the soap opera relationship with politics has been compounded by this magical thinking, vibes-driven way of having non-politically political conversations with politics as the elephant in the room. And then with this direct objection to Lex's approach that overly assimilates all that humans do to positive values and positive intent. At the level of all of these, have we got enough vegetables from the 15 minutes we've spent together? Let me know. Lots of love.